But welcome and thank you so much for coming to this finale of our first ever RE Denver series. As many of you know, I'm Annie Levinsky. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Denver, and we've really enjoyed putting this program on starting last June and running off and on over the course of this year. I particularly want to thank our partners and sponsors who have joined us in making these events possible and this experiment of engaging on a wide variety of topics related to our built environment. So first, and a special thanks to L2 Church for hosting us 7 times this year. They've been a great partner, very supportive and open to this experiment and to the various different kinds of technological and space needs that we've had, and we're grateful to them. I also want to thank the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which provided us with a $5,000 grant to really talk about how do we broaden our conversations around historic preservation to conversations around the quality of our city and our city's unique identity. And third, a really special thanks to the Center for Advanced Research in Traditional Art and Architecture at the University of Colorado at Denver, and particularly to the program's leader, Christine Frank, who is here with us tonight and you'll hear from a little bit later. I also want to thank the Colorado chapter of the American Planning Association, and those of you who are here tonight to earn continuing education credits, make sure you sign up on the sheets out front, because that's how we prove to them that you were here and you can get your credits. And before I get further into tonight's presentation, I do want to remind everyone that this weekend is Doors Open Denver, which is a great way to go out and look at all of these examples of what we've been talking about Denver's great architecture, to experience seeing your friends and neighbors out walking the streets and going in and out of all of these really wonderful buildings. Historic Denver is proud to be a sponsor and a longtime partner of Doors Open Denver, and we're very much looking forward to Saturday and Sunday. And I also want to make a couple of preservation-related announcements, which are really our traditional bread and butter at Historic Denver, and this is a big week for us. You might have seen that last night, City Council unanimously designated the Stadium Arena at the National Western Stock Show the city's 336th individual landmark. This is something Historic Denver has been advocating for since 2011, and working very actively with the National Western Center Advisory Committee and the city and the North Denver Cornerstone Collaborative to see that happen, and we're very excited to see how that building will be transformed as it is restored and reused as part of the new National Western Center. Also then, this afternoon, right on the heels of that, the Landmark Commission unanimously approved and recommended to City Council the designation of the Emily Griffith Opportunity School site as the city's 337th individual landmark. It's pretty rare to have 2 such big sites come together back to back, but it also is the fruit of several years of labor by Historic Denver, beginning in late 2012, when the district first announced moving the school from that site so it could be sold. And it's a really unique designation that provides for preservation as well as redevelopment opportunities on what is a really catalytic site downtown, and we're excited to see how the old and new will work together on that property. And then also coming up on the same night, we'll have the City Council hearing about Emily Griffith. There will also be a public hearing for the designation of the 200 block of South Lincoln Street. Some people call it Turret Row. If you drive it often, you see a wonderful variety of small Victorian and mid-sized Victorian homes. Many of them do have turrets, and many of them were designed by William Lang, the architect of our own Molly Brown House Museum. So a wonderful little historic district. The community members and neighbors there have been working on it for a number of years, and is another opportunity to hold on to something that really contributes a lot to Denver's character. So we hope you'll stay tuned to those as they continue to progress through the City Council process in the next couple of months. Go ahead. So now we want to get on to our main event tonight and talking about why we're here. As you know, we started this series last summer in response to the growing sense that we were losing something in Denver, and it was something more than buildings. We were losing a sense of our city, a sense that it was a place with a unique identity. And Historic Denver's mission is to enhance the city's unique identity through education, activism, and stewardship on behalf of historic places. But one of those historic places is the city at large, the very character, feeling, and dynamic that reminds us all of where we're from. And since June, we've hosted 6 forums. First, we identified the problem, and I've struggled with the word problem over and over again, but I think there's no way around it. We were trying to solve that problem by engaging Jeff Shepard, Brad Evans, Heather Noyes, and Jim Lindberg. And from them, we learned that issues exist with architectural design, but also with the public realm, zoning, permitting, scale, and a prevailing sense that much of our new construction simply doesn't reflect our local character. Later in September, we tried to tackle head-on what is that character? If we feel like we're losing it, how do we define it? Dick Farley, Mickey Zeppelin, Mary Chandler, and Tina Bishop all pointed to the elements that make Denver, Denver, from the materials, the environmental relationships, the people, places, and the open spaces. In November, Christine Frank helped us understand more about the relationship of buildings to the street and the attributes that make a building a good neighbor. And during that event, we embarked on a hands-on activity to understand what building forms can fit on a vacant lot in one of our traditional neighborhoods. And that exercise really helped produce some interesting ideas, but also raised a lot of questions about the real estate market, land values, and the role those two things have in the design decisions that get made. So after a holiday break in February, we re-engaged and had a whole session on market matters, trying to really digest those kinds of decisions developers must make, the larger market trends, and the lending issues that affect what gets built. Glenn Mueller of the University of Denver, Cassie Wright of Urban Ventures, and Alan Malik from the Center for Community Progress out of Rhode Island helped us tackle that topic. And then last month, Tom Lowe joined us from North Carolina to expand on the question of identity, and which has really remained a constant theme in this series and underlies why we're doing it in the first place. Tom again emphasized the importance of the public realm, debunked the idea that the conversation is simply about architectural preferences, and underscored that homogenization of the American city is a real thing, as Charlotte is experiencing many of the same challenges as Denver. From each of these presentations, we learned important things, and as a result, we have been able to shape and hone our understanding of the issue. We've heard over and over again that community identity, the identity created by our built environment, and the way we as humans interact with it matters. It matters from a quality of life perspective. It matters from a walkability and human scale perspective. It matters from an environmental sustainability perspective, from a durability perspective, and even, of course, from an economic perspective. So tonight we've taken these perspectives and collective learnings from all of the 6 sessions of RE Denver hosted so far, and which have been attended by more than 400 community members, to create our principles for an enduring city. These principles are designed to ensure that Denver remains a great place to live, and that it grows in a way that is sustainable and long-lasting so that the city we enjoy today is still here 50 years from now, including the buildings that we'll build in this boom cycle and the next. The principles are intended to inform change, not to halt it, and to recognize that we are building in a specific place, a place with character, a place with rhythms and patterns, a place with history, and a place that owes much of its success to the qualities embodied in our unique identity. We intend to share our principles with, of course, our historic Denver supporters, the mayor, Denver City Council, city planners, private developers, and of course, community groups, and we hope that you will help us. We believe that the principles can be particularly useful as in the conversations to update Blueprint Denver, which will kick off later this spring, and on the steering committee I will be serving. And we also know that it can help inform the conversations around transit plans and zoning decisions that will ultimately likely follow that conversation. And then after I present the principles this evening, Nicole Malo, our series coordinator and Denver native and urban planner by training, and Christine Frank of CARTA will both come up to talk a little more specifically about the tools that will help us to implement these principles over time. We recognize that Historic Denver will not lead every effort to see these ideals realized, and we hope that each of you will think about how you can support these goals and the partnerships that the community can foster to build an enduring city. And so, without further ado, I bring you Historic Denver's Principles for an Enduring City. And we can't really talk about this conversation without talking a little bit about Jane Jacobs. So I did want to share one of her lasting comments that every place becomes more like every other place, all adding up to no place. And I think that is particularly the problem we are trying to solve, and a simpler way of saying it than I just did. So our first principle, what makes Denver, Denver? We know that this city does have unique attributes. We've talked about it over and over again, but what are they? Several things came up. You see Dick Farley's great drawings here that really showcase some of the attributes we're going to talk about. First, Denver is a city of warm, organic building materials. We see a lot of brick. We see a lot of stone. We see a lot of terracotta. And these are not accidental. We didn't import these bricks from Europe because we were trying to look European. We have a lot of brick here because we have a lot of clay here, and we don't have a lot of wood. So it was a natural building environment that makes sense for this climate and this place. Some of you are also probably familiar with the brick ordinance of Denver's 1860s, designed to prohibit too many urban fires. And so there was a very conscious decision to use these kinds of durable and non-flammable building materials in our early years. But we see them repeated over and over again in different hues and different shades. We see them in new and old architecture. And while red is certainly a prominent color, they are not, our building materials are not all red. We see the brick and stone and masonry in a variety of other shades as well, and again, in a variety of architectural styles. We also know that the sun plays a big role in how we experience our city. Dick Farley described this very eloquently in October. So we know that sun and shade are an important way that our architecture affects us and makes our city feel. We have a lot of buildings with strong eaves and strong sight lines. Even the famous brutalist house we have in Denver gives you a sense of that sun and shade component that is so much a part of the city. Also, our streetcar commercial districts. Denver would not be the city it is without these little embedded neighborhood districts. And we see a lot of repetition in the kinds of buildings that exist in these districts, and a lot of mixed uses. And we'll talk a little bit more about the value of these kinds of buildings in a few minutes, but it's certainly very much a distinctive part of our character. And of course, we wouldn't be in the American West if we didn't talk about the big sky. The Denver sky is big, and we see it all the time. This is, of course, a view from Cramner Park, where it's very prominent. But our parks and our parkways were designed very intentionally to accentuate views of the sky, views to the west, sightlines to the mountains, and sightlines to downtown. It's something we've been protecting in Denver since the 1950s, and something that I think will continue to be on our minds as change moves forward. And then, of course, our green and open spaces. You may have heard Denver described before as a city within a park. And again, this was no accident. It was very much a vision for the city in its early years, and it is a vision that has stood this test of time fairly well, especially as these green spaces have matured over time, and it's something I think many of us still enjoy about the places that we live. Principle number 2, infill before refill. And I'll admit I coined the term refill because I came to realize that not all infill is created equal. As a result of the 1960s and 1970s, Denver has a lot of vacant land near downtown and a lot of scattered grayfield sites around the city. And so this principle really seeks to encourage how we can direct development to these spaces rather than to places where existing historic patterns and buildings exist. Infill that merely replaces previously existing functional buildings is just refill. And this is especially true if that refill doesn't address any particular needs, whether those needs are affordable housing or a better relationship to the public realm or better quality. A 2004 report from the Brookings Institution projects that by 2030, we will have demolished and replaced 82 billion square feet of our current building stock. Since it is estimated that there are about 300 billion square feet of space in the United States today, that means that we're anticipating demolishing nearly 1/3 of our buildings in the next 20 to 25 years. That's a staggering number, and it raises a lot of questions, not just about historic buildings and architecture, but also about sustainability and our environment. The real costs of demolition are pretty profound. It will take as much energy to demolish and reconstruct 82 billion square feet of space as it would to power the entire state of California, the 10th largest economy in the world, for 10 years. Construction debris already accounts for 25% of waste in the municipal waste stream every year, and demolishing 82 billion square feet of space creates enough debris to fill 2,500 NFL stadiums. And it also, recent calculations have demonstrated that it takes 35 to 50 years for an energy-efficient new building to save the amount of energy lost in demolishing an existing building. So when we talk about green building policy and we talk about sustainability, we have to talk about our existing buildings. Fostering true infill will require a lot more analysis, but with the tools that we have today and already existing city data, that analysis is not out of reach. We can and should understand the volume of our vacant lots and their combined buildable potential based on existing zoning. How many residential units could we build without losing a single historic building? How many vacant or underutilized buildings could be retrofitted for new uses or mixed uses? A recent survey of vacant and underutilized properties across 1/3 of New York identified enough space to comfortably house 200,000 people. In our most recent wave of population growth, we absorbed about 100,000 people. What if the next 100,000 lived in existing buildings? Buildings that we know both millennials and baby boomers are attracted to. I have a couple slides to highlight this. This is an apartment building just off of Colfax and Perry. And then this is the building immediately next to it. But the two have very different stories. This building is in the process of being rehabilitated and returned to use as housing. The plans for this property involve demolition. And I'm fascinated by the choices made by these two different property owners about what to do with these two buildings that clearly are Denver buildings. They reflect the attributes that we're talking about. They provide affordable housing. They're located in transit corridors, but they're seeing a very different fate. And what would happen if we instead looked at both of them as sites for reuse? And I'll also highlight my point about vacant lots. The blue box, let's see, over here, is the two properties I'm talking about. Here in the surrounding blocks are the number of vacant lots. And not to mention that the old St. Anthony's site is right here where we are having a lot of significant infill. So again, how can we create policies and practices that value retaining those buildings, not just because they're historic, but because of all the other value that they bring to our community? And here's a picture of just a similar type of vacant lot. This one's actually in Curtis Park. We have these sites all across the city. We need to quantify them and think about how we fill them first. Principle number 4 is about shared spaces, and shared spaces really matter. Sorry, let me see if I can find my notes. So this building is a picture of a building in Curtis Park, but we've talked a lot, Tom Lowe brought it up, we also brought it up in previous forums, about the value of the shared spaces and the public realm, and just how important that is to a city. You see here this building really greeting the street with the entrances facing the sidewalk. This is a new infill construction on the edge of the Curtis Park Historic District. And on the previous slide, that's the building on the far side here. This building is also of a similar vintage, but is less successful at greeting the street. Very small windows, the darkened doorways where you're not quite sure you would want to peek in there, or if someone's coming out, you might not see them until they are right next to you. So this is certainly speaks to the point about the value of creating spaces that are at a human scale and that look to the human experience as we enjoy them. Again, some more examples. Again, new construction, so not focusing entirely on the way our old buildings embrace the street, but here's a project that, again, all the doors face the street. You see clearly how you would enter all those residences. This building, I'm not so sure where you would go in. That might be a door, but I can't quite tell. And we're also seeing a lot of this kind of building where there is actually no door. The only way to access these units, or the only perceivable way to access these units, is in your car, straight into your garage with the door closing behind you. And so I think the question about our shared spaces in the public realm is, what happens to our relationships as a community when we no longer engage? How do we foster a city that values walkability and the pedestrian experience if it's not so enjoyable or doesn't feel safe to walk on those streets? Again, another example where this time the materials may reflect Denver's character, but the only entrances, you actually see the address numbers to this project on the garage doors. And there's a curb cut here on a street that otherwise doesn't have any curb cuts. So I'm really changing the way the public is experiencing that street. So our next principle is builds on that quality of the public realm, about treating green space as a unifying thread. I already talked about the importance of our parks and parkways to the city's framework and the city's identity. And that's really one of the most important components of Denver and the way we experience it. Our most popular neighborhoods are oriented around parks and parkways, and they're connected by green strips. These spaces are not accidental. They're the most prominent symbols of Denver's earliest planning effort, based on a city beautiful vision. And that vision believed that design and beauty had the power to improve lives. Essentially, over 100 years ago, they had already embraced the idea that the quality of our places and the quality of the public realm were vital to a good city. The parks and parkways were laid out and designed to connect important places and neighborhoods, and the parkways actually predate most of our built environment and frame our neighborhoods. And so without them, we lose that sense of connectivity. So we must not only protect the official public spaces, but also remember that those little green strips at the edge of your lawn, that pesky little area between the sidewalk and the street, those matter too. Heather Noyes brought this painfully to bear at our first forum, and had some examples like this, where we see on this side that traditional green strip creating continuity and repetition down the street and a pleasant pedestrian experience. And then we see that breaking up in an area in Berkeley where they have not continued that tradition, but instead filled in that space with a material that is less inviting. I think we all recognize that green is not always the most obvious thing in our dry Denver climate, but I think there are a lot of creative solutions to that go beyond concrete. Here's another example of a building that in its location actually does quite well, is a pretty successful new building. But again, where does this provide respite or shade for the person experiencing that public realm? And this property, a new construction on one of those parkways, those really important parkways that are so valued in Denver, this is the side yard where you've lost that sense of green space. And those spaces were intended to be communal spaces and places that we would all value and that we would all be responsible to each other to maintain. Fixing this problem is not simple, and we know that. It involves a lot of different city agencies, and it involves collective will. But if we don't talk about its value, then we can't address it. So this has come up a lot in all of our forums as well, substance over splash. I think there's been a lot of commentary that the issues we're seeing in Denver's built environment have to do with architectural style, with people maybe just not liking modern design, and I think that's not the case. I think it's also come to bear that in order for a project to be successful, it must stand out. It must be showy or flashy. And I think what we are hoping to underscore with our principles is that it's not about architectural style, but it is about substance, and that it's okay to be a quality background building, and that some of our buildings should be background buildings. They do not all need to stand out, that the background buildings are the backbone of our city because they reinforce rhythms and patterns. And the rhythms and patterns are essential to the visual harmony. Richard Barkham published an article last month about London and a section of London that has been particularly successful, and he talked about the importance of visual harmony and rhythm and pattern to the human experience and then ultimately to the economic success of that place. Background buildings, regardless of style, have a quality that lasts and it avoids trendiness. We're learning a lot today, and you hear things on the internet about the perils of fast fashion, and perhaps this is the perils of fast architecture. There are buildings that are meant to stand out: civic institutions, experimental projects, museums, churches. But multi-unit apartment buildings? Probably not. When you think about great cities around the world, they save the splash for the places where it matters, and they value harmony and quality everywhere else. And it's not a critique of old versus new. So again, we have some more examples here. This building almost gets there in some of its rhythms, but it's hard not to notice the things that stand out about it and to wonder what we'll think about them 10 years from now. Here's a contrast, a project of about the same size and not too far geographically, that seems to accept that it's subservient to its surroundings. It does not try to jump out at you. And again, you can identify entrances, and you can identify, it's a little spot here, but you can see that it continues that rhythm of green space. Again here, it's almost as if by just changing paint colors, perhaps we can create a sense of distinction or splash. Whereas here, and people may not like this building, they may think it's too traditional, but you can tell where the entrances are. You can see that it's trying to reflect some rhythms and relationships to its neighbors. Principle number 6 is about finding that rhythm and relationship among buildings, or probably even more simply put, principle 6 is about context. Denver is a city of neighborhoods, and each neighborhood has unique attributes, contexts, and patterns. It's been one of our reoccurring themes, but it's also clear that one size does not fit all, and since zoning is a blunt tool, we have to figure out new ways to acknowledge that we have unique spaces even within the city, and that every neighborhood has its own unique rhythms. Last month, Don Elliott of Clarion & Associates made a presentation and noted that the U.S. housing stock expands by about 2% every year. So any significant change of types of new housing construction happen fairly slowly. And this means that 98% of next year's housing stock is already here, and 80% of the next decade's housing stock is already here. And so that means that the building next to your new development is probably going to be there for a while, whether you like it or not. And so that context, it's sticking around. And when we build new, we need to be sensitive to it. Otherwise, we create that sense of jarring distinction that disrupts our neighborhoods, and in the long term will probably stay with us. Because in most cases, we are not building on a blank slate. Alan Malik, our guest speaker from February from the Center for Community Progress, also brought up the concept of micro-context, that each neighborhood, and in some cases each block, has its own rhythm. And so how can we use a preservation concept, a concept known as character-defining features, to help neighbors and developers understand an area and build to its strengths? How do we ensure a visual harmony that I already mentioned, that it's retained and that it's reinforced by new construction? And I know Joel Noble's here, and I keep using Curtis Park examples, but Curtis Park has done a lot of this well. So here we see a block of historic Curtis Park homes with a lot of infill, and in this case, the zoning encouraged this scale of infill. But what I wanted to note about it is you see the tight pattern of the homes. They're narrow lots, they're narrow homes. There's not a lot of space between them, and that's the distinct pattern here. Not far away, in City Park West, we have a different pattern. Larger lots, wider homes. We have these different style front porches, different shapes, roofs, different heights. In this neighborhood, we see the Denver Hill, which I know a lot of us hate to mow, but is very distinctive. And so, I think I'm sure there are a lot of opinions about this new infill house. I actually used to live down the block and have watched and followed it as it was constructed. And I think there are some things that it does quite well in terms of fitting in here. And then there's some very simple things it could have done better to reflect the rhythms, like recognizing the Denver Hill instead of turning away from it, or noticing that in this case, front door steps lead straight to front doors as opposed to being slightly offset from where the front door is actually located. Here, let's see, is I think a really nice example in Highland. I couldn't get a good picture with both houses, so these are two pictures of houses that are in fact next to each other. And I think do a really nice job of referencing one another and demonstrating that it's not about style, it's about pattern and rhythm. They have the same height front porch, the same color tones, a similar height, and a lot of things that relate. Here you see those steps leading straight up and taking you right in. You see the Denver Hill present in both locations. And I'd maintain that historically, we can really see that the rhythm and pattern can be maintained even when multifamily and single family exist together, and they can do that quite peacefully. We see this a lot in Capitol Hill and Congress Park, where we have sort of mid-century or 1960s and 70s multifamily buildings that have been inserted into what were previously single-family neighborhoods. But they work, and they aren't jarring because they honor the setback, they honor the scale, they honor the materiality. And you'll even notice things about the window heights and the roof heights and the sight lines that create a relationship there and make it possible to mix those things together. This already happens a lot in historic districts. How do we help it happen in other places, I think, is one of our big questions. And here's, I think, a nice, good example and a not so good example. And I should have credited this slide because one picture comes from Heather Noyes and the other from Christine Frank. But we see the utter lack of relationship between these two properties, as if this property is saying to this property, I'll see you later. I know you're not going to be around very long. Whereas in this case, we have a quite large and dense multifamily development, again, existing right next to a single-family home. Yes, it is a larger single-family home, but it still is much more successful at honoring the context and the pedestrian experience of that block than what we're seeing here. So our next principle, principle number 7, is that durability plus adaptability equals sustainability. One thing we like to tout about Denver is our relationship to the environment. We like to think of ourselves as a forward-thinking, sustainable city, but being truly sustainable is about a lot more than having energy-efficient appliances. Not only is the adaptive reuse of buildings a sustainable strategy, but so too is building new buildings that will last, that will not require constant replacement, and will certainly not be replaceable within one generation. So materials are not only important in terms of aesthetics, but also in terms of durability. The old brick buildings of lower downtown were built for a wide variety of purposes, almost none of which they serve today. but their solid construction and adaptable nature make them work more than a century after their initial construction. And I really hope that we can say the same about the buildings we're building today. Here's a new project, the One City Block in the Uptown neighborhood, that I think reflects some of that durability and stability that we hope to see. But we see some other projects where some of the new materials that are common in construction are estimated to have a durable life of 20 to 40 years. Imagine the energy costs and waste produced by recladding buildings every 20 years. A short-term savings may be a long-term cost, but who's going to bear these costs? This talks about the really common issues that arise with the EFIS building material. Now, some of these can be mitigated if it's installed properly, but it's been a widespread problem that moisture does creep into these and they deteriorate, creating that 20-year lifespan. Principle number 8, foster the fine grain. Being durable and enduring is building communities that are resilient. The National Trust for Historic Preservation study, Older, Smaller, Better, has demonstrated that mixed-use areas with diverse building ages, size, and use are more prepared to withstand turbulent economic times than large-scale developments. These areas also tend to punch above their weight class in terms of density and intensity of use, with active daytime uses, integrated residential components, and nightlife. You've probably also heard, and it's been mentioned here, about the concept of the missing middle and the incremental development. There are ways that we can add density with a fine-grained touch, as opposed to adding it only through bulk and height. In fact, this was a common practice a century ago, and a diversity of housing options often coexisted within a single block. Again, multifamily, single family, multifamily, existing harmoniously and with a pattern and rhythm. In our streetcar commercial districts, which I mentioned is one of our character-defining attributes, they're really one of our city's greatest strengths. And another lesson from the Older, Smaller, Better study was the importance of stewarding this legacy, not just in Denver, but around the country. These districts support a vibrancy and human-scale environment that's really a key part of our quality of life, our economic development and revitalization potential, and our long-term durability. For example, there are more jobs per square foot in smaller, age-diverse areas than in new, large developments. Principle number 9, and there are only 10, so don't worry, we're getting close. Principle number 9 has to do with parking. And we felt like we really couldn't complete these principles unless we address this issue. We know that it's a hot button issue, and it's hard to go anywhere in Denver these days without hearing complaints about parking and traffic. We know that we're in a transitional phase and that our transit options have not caught up with our population growth. But if we want to steward our legacy of a walkable, human-scale city and maintain Denver's unique identity, we need to be more thoughtful about parking. Whether required by zoning or simply seen as a market necessity, parking is driving a lot of design decisions, and decisions that will be very difficult to preserve over time and to reuse. If parking is a primary structural component of a building, how will we reuse it decades from now when our driving habits and our technologies change? I think both these photographs underscore how difficult it will be to figure out how to retrofit when you have this many stories of parking structure in a building. I recognize, as I mentioned, that this is a hot button issue. But we need to be having honest conversations about our priorities. The conversation about parking comes up in almost every preservation issue that Historic Denver is dealing with these days. And unfortunately, after almost 50 years of the preservation movement, parking and preservation continue to be at loggerheads. And I think as we think about ourselves as an enduring city, we're going to need to be honest about which is more important to us. And finally, principle number 10, cultivating a community ethic. Having conversations about, yes, parking and preservation and urban design and architecture and building quality is important. And this is the underlying reason that Historic Denver started the Regarding Denver series. We need a place where we can talk constructively about how our city is changing and how we can support and maintain its character as it grows. We need a constituency that cares, gets educated, and advocates. I know many of you here tonight already do this in a myriad of ways, and I hope that these principles will encourage continued dialogue and result in action.